The cost of living crisis is something that's affecting you, me, and seemingly everyone we know. And this is despite the fact that for the first time in recorded British history, we actually have more jobs than there are people in this country. So you'd be forgiven for thinking then that we should all be flush with cash. But that's not actually the case, is it? And the mainstream media would have you believe that the reasons behind the cost of living crisis are down to a combination of the war in Ukraine, Brexit, and repercussions from the COVID-19 pandemic. But they're not actually the real reasons as to why we have a cost of living crisis. Want to know what the real reasons are? Well, in this video, I'm going to explain. We do videos aimed to help employees, and that's employees either in work or those seeking work. The purpose of the channel is to be very real and honest and try to read between the lines of what's actually going on. If you like this content, do consider subscribing to the channel, and if you do, don't forget to click the bell icon, select all so you won't miss any one of our videos, and if you like the content in this video, give us a like. So if you haven't gathered from the intro of this video, I don't particularly trust the UK government or mainstream media. And if you ask the general person on the street, they're probably going to tell you the same thing. But as far as I'm concerned, I do think that people will, without realising it, blindly follow and believe what the media tell them and believe what propaganda there is. And most people don't seem to go against the grain and go, actually, what's really going on here? And I'm probably one of those people that do. But I do it for two reasons. One, before I form an opinion on anything, I prefer to take a bit of a neutral viewpoint, look at the evidence and the facts, have a little bit of a read into it if it's something that I want to form an opinion on, and then I'll try and draw my own conclusions from that. But secondly, it's also important to my business. As a recruitment company owner, we need to know what's going on economically so we can strategize for what type of clients we're going to work with, where we're going to find our candidates, being able to predict how the market's going so we know maybe where we can find candidates for clients and also the type of clients that we want to be working with and industries that we probably want to be getting into. So we need to know all this stuff regardless. So it hasn't been too difficult for me to look into this and be able to find out, well, what the media are telling us, the mainstream media and what the UK government are telling us as the causes for the cost of living crisis, but they don't really make much sense and there's no real evidence behind it. So what I want to do is basically give you some facts on why, firstly, the war in Ukraine and then moving on to Brexit and then moving on to the COVID-19 pandemic, certainly the narrative that the government are giving us, don't really match up to actually what's really going on. And then I want to give you the actual truth of what is actually happening and why the cost of living crisis is really going on. So if you look at the war in Ukraine, what the mainstream media are telling us is the cost of that war and the implications on this country are quite significant. That be by way of either what's happening directly with Ukraine or directly the implications on Russia. So you'd be forgiven for thinking, well, hang on a minute, we must do a lot of business with them, and presumably because certainly Russia is a big economy, that it's going to affect us in a big way here. But if you actually look at the facts and figures, they don't really add up to that. If you actually look firstly at Ukraine, so if you think, well, we must import or buy a lot of stuff from that country, do a lot of trade with them, well, we actually only import on an annual basis about 2% of our goods and services from the Ukraine. And in reality, there isn't anything that they specifically do that is critical to our economy. But what about exports then? What do we actually export to the Ukraine? Well, again, 2% is what we actually export to the Ukraine. So it's not as if we've got tons of money coming in from things they buy from us either. But what about Russia? Surely as a major economy, we must import and do quite a bit of business with them, surely. Think about oil and gas. That's what they're known for, right? Oligarchs, stuff like that. So if they're not importing to us or we're putting sanctions on them, that's going to impact us directly. And that must be a major cause of it. Well, the actual total imports we do from Russia, well, it's just 2.2%. So it's not exactly a major importer to us. They do significantly import 9% of our total oil, though, and 4% of our total gas. And that is a more significant number. However, what you've got to bear in mind is with any major economy, the UK being no different, you will have it where it's factored in that the amount of supply of commodities or any products, you're not going to be reliant on any one country, because then if anything happens to them, you're quite exposed. So the UK has at least 20 importers of oil and gas that I can find. There's probably more that are less significant, but what will happen is if there is a supply chain issue or a production issue, something like that, the UK government can move approximately 5% of its supply and move that order to other routes. And that can be Venezuela, for example, maybe even Canada. You don't necessarily need it from Russia. It can come from out of Europe elsewhere, and it's not a major problem. So if we were importing 9% of oil from Russia at the beginning of the war, pretty quickly within a month period, we're at least importing 5% less than that, probably down to about 4%, which isn't that significant. Okay, it's going to have some impact on our oil industry, but it's not exactly going to lead to an economic crisis. And as for gas, well, we produce 50% of our gas in this country in the UK by North Sea gas anyway. And again, we can move that around pretty quickly. So neither of them is quite as significant as you might think. What about the exports we do with Russia? Maybe we do a lot of exports to them. Well, we actually export 0.9%, less than 1% of all of our export go to Russia. Again, they're not exactly a major trading partner. In fact, we import more goods from Holland, Belgium, Ireland and Turkey than we do Russia and Ukraine combined. So they're not exactly big trading partners with us. If we're looking at those facts, the war in Ukraine, directly or even indirectly, well, it hasn't really impacted us enough to lead to a cost of living crisis. And the mainstream media hark on about it, and as much as I'm saddened by the events over there and on a personal level feel that it's a needless loss of life, any war, but particularly this one being closer to home and reminding people of, Nazi Germany and how people were treated then. And it's sad to see that despite how far we've moved on with technology, we're still fighting wars and people are dying needlessly. The fact of the matter is that the war in Ukraine isn't actually any real reason based on the evidence of why we have a cost of living crisis. So let's move on then to second reason, Brexit. Well, Brexit itself, if you look at the timelines and the geography, they don't actually match up as to being a major contributing factor in any way, shape or form to the current cost of living crisis. For example, the actual impacts of Brexit, have they impacted our country? Yes, they have, and regardless of your political leanings, the actual issues with Brexit itself on our economy, well, they started quite a while before the cost of living crisis, and therefore they haven't been anyway a significant contributor to it being a major root cause to the problem. And nor geographically is it significant just to the UK. In fact, the EU and many economies all across the world are affected by the cost of living crisis at the moment, so we're not alone in that. And only us as a country, or maybe you could argue some of the EU countries that did a lot of business with the UK, they're the only ones that you could argue have been affected by Brexit. So the timelines and the geography of it don't really match up to Brexit being a contributing factor to the cost of living crisis either. Finally, what about the COVID-19 pandemic then? Surely that itself must have more of an impact. Well, this is where the truth lies. However, not in the way the mainstream media has communicated it anyway. You see, the mainstream media would have you think that because of lockdowns and supply chain issues based on lockdowns and impacts around the world and regulations and rules that people have put in place to be able to stop the spread of COVID-19, that somehow has led to us being in a position of a cost of living crisis, with the combination of the war in Ukraine that we've just established doesn't have that much of a significant impact on us, or Brexit itself, which again doesn't have that much of a significant impact on us. With the COVID-19 pandemic, the reality is that lockdowns have generally subsided now. Yes, you still have them in places like China and a few other countries, but realistically, most of their production and their supply chain has actually improved significantly. And the supply chain issues have happened a long time before the cost of living crisis has really started to bite. So again, the timescales don't quite match up. But as I say, there is truth in the COVID-19 pandemic being the root problem. But this is where the government aren't telling you. Let's rewind back to answer this, back to the pandemic itself. 11.7 million people in this country were put on furlough. Okay, and that was at a cost of around £70 billion. Now, the government itself was funding 80% of people's wages, as most of you remember, and I'm sure people watching this video found themselves on furlough. Now, I ask you this, how much of that furlough money that you were given have you had to pay back directly? Was it a loan or was it a gift? Well, it appeared to be some sort of grant to people. The reason why the government did it, and I do think it was a very good idea, bear in mind it was actually invented by Rishi Sunak, it's actually a Swiss idea, and we nicked the idea, so it's not authentic to him, but nevertheless, it was a good idea. Basically, it stopped people being made redundant or losing their jobs, and it stopped companies going under because they were able to cover their biggest cost, which is typically wages. So, in actual fact, it was quite a good thing, and it certainly aided the economic recovery of this country. It certainly got people back on track, and we found ourselves in a position with a record amount of jobs, or record amount of job applications, more so than there are people in this country. So, a good thing all round. But you didn't have to pay anything back, did you? Or maybe you did, and that's the part that the government don't want to tell you. You see, what happened is that cost 70 billion quid. The UK economy is already in debt. However, the amount of GDP, that's the amount of money, if you like, that the UK economy brings into it in one way, shape or form, 85% of that total amount across a year is actually debt. So we've got 85% worth of debt in this country, and 70 billion quid added to it just by furlough, not including all the other impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, had a significant impact on this country. So you might be thinking, okay, well, COVID did have an effect then. Surely that's the reason. Well, it's not the reason that the government are telling you is actually why the cost of living crisis is happening. You see, the cost of living crisis, well, it's engineered. It's deliberate. They're actually putting it in place physically behind the scenes. You see, the UK government, and in fact all governments and major economies around the world, well, they did the same thing. They put people on one way, shape or form on things like furloughs, or bailed companies out, or tried to keep their economy going until the pandemic subsided so they could recover quickly. That meant borrowing a lot of money or putting themselves in debt. And when you borrow a lot of money, guess what? Someone has to pick up the tab for that. Well, in this instance, it happens to be, like almost all instances, the taxpayer. And bear in mind, the pandemic was a global issue, so all governments have to pay it off. Now, how do governments make their money? Well, their money comes in through tax. That's how they do it. That's their income stream. So if you go out to the general public in your country and you say to them, right, I'm going to have to put taxes up, what do you think that's going to do for voter confidence in your party? Well, it's going to be career suicide. And one could argue that Boris Johnson's probably already committed career suicide, but the Tory party, maybe another leader, maybe they can work it out slightly different. But certainly if they come out as a party and say we're going to raise taxes, nobody's going to vote for them. So you've got to be a little bit smarter than that. You have to find another way of getting that money income. Well, one way of doing it is through VAT. So imagine it. You're doing your weekly shop and it costs you £100, let's say, of shopping. 20% of that is going to VAT. But let's say a government can influence things so the prices go up to £200 for the same items. They're going to get double as much money in VAT. So if you can engineer a way of putting all the prices up of everything, you're going to make more money. And the companies that are going to be declaring profits on that, well, they're also going to be paying tax to you. So you get a double bonus. So if you put all the prices up, that's going to be something that's going to impact the general public. Well, why is this happening? Well, if you spin the narrative that the war in Ukraine, the impacts of COVID, Brexit, all things that are external factors that are nothing to do with you and not your fault directly, not your government's fault, then you can argue a justification for prices going up. But let's look at oil and gas costs, for example. Energy crisis being a big one that people are experiencing at the moment. Well, the governments love this to be able to have taxable income. Because you've got to bear in mind, when you go to the fuel pump, you're not just paying VAT on your fuel, you're paying fuel duty, a whole separate tax on top. So that's quite a lot of money. So you'd think, well, maybe the wholesale price of oil and gas has shot up and that's why they've had to pass the costs on to the consumer. But the actual cost of a barrel of oil is less than it was pre-pandemic. Point being, this has all been engineered. You're in a position where the government are deliberately encouraging and engineering the whole system to have their prices put up so they can make more tax to pay off the debt. Now, you might be angered a little bit by this, but what did people really expect? If you sat there for a whole year on furlough and you haven't lost your job and you're being given money to sit at home, what do you think they're going to do? Just give you that money for free? So hopefully that gives you an understanding of what the real reason behind the cost of living crisis is. If you like this video, do click the like button. If you have any comments, ideas for other videos, or anything you're thinking has angered you about this video, or anything you want to say to get your 2 pence worth, put them in the comments below and I'll try and reply to you. And don't forget to click the bell icon, subscribe to this channel and select all if you do want to see more of our content moving forward, because we're going to put more stuff out like this. Hopefully you enjoyed this video and we'll see you for the next one.